April 3rd, 2024. Security cameras captured the last time Caleb Morrison walked out of Margaret Bellwood's mansion as a free man. The 78-year-old widow he'd cared for was dead, and her family wanted him in prison. They accused him of stealing $2.6 million through manipulation and lies. But what the hidden cameras recorded over 2 years would expose a conspiracy so twisted, it would destroy a family's legacy forever. When loyalty is punished and greed wears the mask of justice, who decides what's right? Stay until the end, because the final courtroom revelation will leave you speechless. This is a true story of betrayal, and the cameras caught everything. Caleb Morrison had driven through the night to escape the silence in his father's empty house. Now, standing at the wrought-iron gates of the Bellwood estate, he wondered if he'd traded one kind of quiet for another. The mansion rose before him like something out of a magazine. White columns, pristine gardens, windows that caught the morning sun. His Honda coughed as he pulled into the circular driveway, out of place against the marble fountain and manicured hedges. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and expensive candles nobody had lit in months. A housekeeper led him through hallways lined with photographs, charity galas, ribbon cuttings, smiling faces frozen in better times. She didn't speak until they reached the sunroom. Margaret Bellwood sat in a wheelchair facing the garden, her back to the door. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her shoulders were hunched, her right hand motionless in her lap. "Mrs. Bellwood," the housekeeper said softly. "Your new caregiver is here." Margaret didn't turn. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, slurred by the stroke. "They want me forgotten." The housekeeper left without another word. Caleb stood there, unsure if he should respond or pretend he hadn't heard. He'd taken this job because he needed the money, because his father's medical bills had drained everything, because he couldn't stand being alone anymore. But standing in that sunroom, watching this woman stare at a garden she couldn't walk through, he felt something shift. He pulled a chair beside her wheelchair. "Mrs. Bellwood," he said quietly, "tell me about the person you were before the stroke." Her head turned slowly. Her eyes, still sharp, still aware, locked onto his. For a long moment, she studied him like she was deciding whether he was worth the effort. Then tears filled her eyes. "I built schools," she whispered. 17, across the state. My foundation helped thousands. Caleb leaned forward. "What happened to it?" "My son, Nathaniel, took over, changed everything. Now it's just condos, profit." She tried to lift her right hand, but couldn't. Frustration flickered across her face, then resignation. Caleb had seen that look before, in his father's eyes during those final months. The look of someone who'd already given up. "How long since your children visited?" he asked. Margaret's jaw tightened. 3 months, maybe 4. Caleb nodded slowly, anger rising in his chest. He'd spent every day of his father's illness by his side. And this woman, who'd built schools, who'd changed lives, was rotting in a mansion alone. "Mrs. Bellwood," he said, standing, "I'm going to wheel you outside. You're going to sit in that garden and feel the sun. And then you're going to tell me every story you remember about those schools." For the first time, something like hope crossed her face. But as Caleb helped her onto the terrace, adjusting the blanket across her lap, he saw them. Fresh bruises along her left forearm, dark purple against pale skin. They weren't from a fall. They were fingerprints. Margaret caught him staring. Don't, she whispered, fear replacing hope. Please, don't ask. Caleb's stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Someone had hurt her. And she was too afraid to say who. The bruises faded, but Caleb couldn't forget them. He spent the next weeks digging through the mansion's forgotten corners, closets stacked with bankers' boxes, an attic filled with framed newspaper clippings, a library lined with thank you letters yellowed by time. Margaret Bellwood hadn't just been wealthy. She'd been a force. One evening in late February, Caleb wheeled her into the library and opened a box of photographs. Margaret's eyes widened as he held up a picture of her standing beside a newly built schoolhouse. Children gathered around her, their faces bright with hope. "Do you remember this?" he asked. Her good hand trembled as she touched the photo. Ridgeland, elementary, 1998. We built 12 that year. Caleb pulled out more. Ribbon cuttings, scholarship ceremonies, community dinners. For the first time since he'd arrived, Margaret smiled. Not politely, not weakly. A real smile that softened the hardness the stroke had left behind. Each night after that, they went through the boxes together. Caleb would read letters aloud, teachers thanking her for saving their schools, students writing about college acceptances, parents describing how the foundation changed their children's futures. And slowly, Margaret's speech improved. The words came easier. Her sentences stretched longer. By April, she could speak almost clearly. "My children think I'm already gone," she said one evening, staring at a photograph of Nathaniel and Evelyn as children. "They're just waiting for the body to catch up." Caleb set down the photo he'd been holding. "What do you mean?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "Nathaniel took over the foundation when I had the stroke. Said I was too sick to manage it. But he didn't continue my work. He sold the land we'd bought for schools, built condos instead, luxury apartments, profit over purpose. Can't you stop him? I signed everything over when I thought I was dying. I trusted him." Her voice cracked. "I trusted both of them." In March, Nathaniel visited. Caleb watched from the hallway as Margaret's son stood over her wheelchair, barely looking at her face. He placed documents in her lap, legal papers with highlighted signature lines. "Just sign here, Mother," Nathaniel said, his tone flat. "It's routine financial stuff. Nothing to worry about." Margaret's hand shook as she tried to read the fine print, but her vision wasn't strong enough. Caleb stepped into the room. "What are these documents?" he asked. Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward him, annoyed. "Family, business. Not your concern. If Mrs. Bellwood can't read them clearly, maybe she should review them with her attorney first." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "She doesn't need an attorney. She needs to trust her son." Margaret looked between them, confused and afraid. Finally, she scribbled her name on the papers. Nathaniel left without saying goodbye. That night, Caleb found Margaret crying in the sunroom. "I don't know what I signed," she whispered. The breakthrough came in May. Margaret's new physical therapist, a woman Caleb had hired over Evelyn's objections, helped her regain partial use of her right hand. It was shaky, but functional. And one morning, Caleb woke to find a note on his bedside table, written in uneven handwriting. "Check the foundation accounts. Nathaniel is stealing. I need proof before I'm gone." Caleb stared at the note, his heart pounding. Margaret had been aware all along. The stroke had trapped her, but her mind had stayed sharp, watching everything, unable to stop it. That afternoon, using Margaret's legal access and passwords, Caleb logged into the Bellwood Foundation's financial records. What he found made his stomach turn. Nathaniel had embezzled $4.7 million over 18 months, funneling money through shell companies with names that sounded legitimate but led nowhere. Evelyn had sold 2 of Margaret's rental properties without authorization, pocketing the proceeds and forging Margaret's signature on the sale documents. They weren't just neglecting their mother. They were robbing her. Margaret read the printouts with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "They're waiting for me to die," she said, her voice hollow, "so there's no witness." Caleb knelt beside her wheelchair. "Then we document everything. We get proof, and we make sure they don't get away with it." Margaret looked at him, something fierce flickering in her eyes. "You'd do that? Risk your job? For me? You're not just a job anymore, Mrs. Bellwood." On June 15th, Caleb installed hidden cameras throughout the mansion. Small, discreet, positioned in the living room, study, hallways, and Margaret's bedroom. Margaret's instinct told her the threats would escalate now that she was recovering. She was right. 3 days later, Nathaniel arrived unannounced with 2 men in expensive suits. Caleb watched from the kitchen as they surrounded Margaret's wheelchair in the study. Nathaniel's voice was cold. "Mother, you're not competent to manage your affairs anymore. Sign this power of attorney, and Evelyn and I will handle everything." Margaret stared at the document, then at her son. "No," she said clearly. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but his next words sent ice through Caleb's veins. "Then we'll have you declared incompetent, and you'll spend your final days in a state facility where nobody will hear you." The cameras captured everything. The panic attack left Margaret weak for days. Caleb stayed by her bedside, monitoring her blood pressure, adjusting her medications, watching her sleep fitfully. The paramedics had stabilized her that night, but the fear lingered in her eyes every time she woke. "They'll come back," she whispered, "on the 3rd day. And next time, they'll bring lawyers who won't leave without my signature." Caleb pulled a chair closer. "Then we need someone on your side. Someone they can't intimidate." Margaret's gaze drifted to the window. "Harrison Webb, my attorney. He's the only one I trust. Can he come here without them knowing?" She nodded slowly. "He owes me his career. He'll come." Harrison Webb arrived on a Tuesday evening in early July, slipping through the service entrance like a ghost. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than Caleb. He sat across from Margaret in the study, and for the first time since Caleb had met her, Margaret spoke with the authority of the woman she used to be. "I want to change my will, Harrison. Everything." Webb didn't flinch. "How much are you leaving Nathaniel and Evelyn?" $100,000 each, enough that they can't claim total disinheritance. "And the rest?" Margaret glanced at Caleb, who stood near the doorway, unsure if he should leave. She gestured for him to stay. "The rest goes to Caleb. 2.6 million. The house, the foundation, everything." Webb's pen paused over his notepad. He looked at Caleb, then back at Margaret. "You understand what this will trigger?" "A war," Margaret said, calmly. "But I've already lost my children. I won't lose my legacy, too." Over 3 visits, Webb drafted the new will. Margaret was meticulous, dictating exact instructions. Caleb would reopen the Bellwood Foundation under its original mission, building schools, funding scholarships, serving communities the way she'd intended. no condos. No profit schemes, just purpose. But it was the final clause that made Webb raise an eyebrow. If any family member harasses, threatens, or legally attacks Caleb Morrison after my death, their inheritance is voided entirely. The funds will go to charity. Webb set down his pen. Margaret, this is a poison pill. If they so much as look at him wrong, then they get nothing. Margaret finished. Let them choose between their greed and their cruelty. Caleb's chest tightened. Mrs. Bellwood, you don't have to do this. I don't need. You gave me my voice back when they wanted me silent. Margaret interrupted, her tone firm. You saw me as human when they saw me as an obstacle. This isn't charity, Caleb. This is justice. By August, their days had found a rhythm. Mornings in the garden, Margaret's hand growing steadier as she practiced watercolor painting, a hobby she'd abandoned after the stroke. Afternoons reviewing foundation plans, Caleb learning about grant proposals and community outreach. Evenings reading together, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes laughing at old stories Margaret would share about her younger years. The cameras captured it all, moments that felt ordinary but weren't. Caleb adjusting the blanket over Margaret's lap. Margaret correcting his pronunciation of a donor's name, the two of them celebrating the day she walked 10 steps unassisted. You know they'll say you manipulated me, Margaret said one evening in late August. Caleb looked up from the book he'd been reading aloud. I know. They'll say I wasn't competent. That you coerced me. I know that too. Margaret studied him for a long moment. And you're still willing to see this through? You're not just a job anymore, Mrs. Bellwood. You're family. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, her jaw set with the same determination Caleb had seen the day she'd refused to sign Nathaniel's documents. September arrived with cooler air and a fragile sense of peace. Margaret was stronger now, walking short distances with a cane, speaking clearly, even laughing more often. Caleb allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe the worst was behind them. Then, on September 22nd, the cameras captured something that shattered that illusion. It was just after midnight. Margaret was asleep in her bedroom. Caleb was in his quarters on the second floor. The motion sensor in the foyer triggered. Someone had entered through the front door. Evelyn moved through the house like she owned it, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. She went straight to Margaret's bedroom, opened drawers, rifled through papers on the nightstand. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. The camera's audio was faint, but clear enough. She's stronger than we thought, Evelyn said, her voice tight with frustration. He's making her better. We need to act faster. A pause. I don't care how. Just make it happen before she's competent enough to fight us in court. She hung up, glanced once at Margaret's sleeping form, and left the way she'd come. Caleb watched the footage the next morning, his hands shaking. Margaret watched it beside him, her face pale but resolute. They're not waiting anymore, she whispered, and for the first time, Caleb realized this wasn't just about money. It was about survival. October arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Nathaniel and Evelyn began visiting more frequently, always unannounced, always with someone new. First, it was Dr. Pemberton, a neurologist Margaret hadn't seen since her initial stroke. He arrived with a clipboard and a condescending smile, asking Margaret questions designed to confuse. Mrs. Bellwood, what year is it? 2022. And who is the president? Margaret answered without hesitation, her voice steady. When he asked her to solve a basic math problem, she didn't just solve it. She explained the logic behind it. When he tried to trip her up with complex financial questions about her foundation, she recited account numbers from memory and detailed exactly how much Nathaniel had stolen. Dr. Pemberton left without signing anything. A week later, Evelyn brought another doctor, then another. Each time, Margaret performed flawlessly, her clarity undeniable. The cameras captured every visit, every question, every frustrated expression on her children's faces when the doctors refused to declare her incompetent. But it was November that cut the deepest. Evelyn arrived on a Saturday morning with Margaret's grandchildren, Nathaniel's 15-year-old twins, Sophia and Ethan. Margaret's face lit up when she saw them. She hadn't seen them in over 2 years. "My darlings," she said, reaching out her hand. But the twins didn't move. They stood stiffly beside their aunt, their expressions rehearsed. "Grandma," Sophia said, her voice flat, "why is a stranger controlling your life?" Margaret's smile faltered. Ethan stepped forward, his words clearly scripted. "Mom says you're not yourself anymore, that this man is making decisions for you." Caleb, standing in the hallway, felt his chest tighten. He wanted to leave, to give them privacy, but something told him to stay. Margaret looked at Evelyn, then back at her grandchildren. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Caleb isn't a stranger. He's the only family who stayed when all of you left." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "Where were you when I couldn't speak?" Margaret continued, her voice rising. "When I couldn't walk, when I needed someone to simply see me as more than a burden." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Ethan looked at the floor. "You were taught to say those words," Margaret said softly. "But I need you to hear mine. This man gave me my life back. And if loving him more than the people who abandoned me makes me incompetent, then so be it." The twins left in tears. Evelyn's expression turned to stone, and as she walked past Caleb, she leaned in close enough for only him to hear. "You're going to regret this." By December, the gloves were off. Nathaniel filed for emergency guardianship, submitting a petition that painted Caleb as a predator, isolating Margaret, controlling her medications, coercing her into financial decisions. The allegations were lies, but they were detailed and convincing. Harrison Webb moved fast. He submitted the security footage showing Nathaniel's threats, Evelyn's midnight intrusion, and Margaret's clear mental state in every recorded interaction. He brought in Margaret's doctors, who testified that her cognitive function had improved dramatically under Caleb's care. The hearing was brutal. Nathaniel's lawyer painted Margaret as a vulnerable widow, manipulated by a younger man with financial motives. Webb countered by playing video after video of Margaret's own words, her laughter, her clarity, her agency. In January 2023, the judge dismissed the petition with a warning. "Mr. Bellwood, if you file another frivolous motion in this court, I will hold you in contempt. Your mother is competent. This case is closed." But the victory felt hollow. Margaret's health declined through the winter. Not her mind, but her body. The stress of the legal battle wore on her. She stopped painting, stopped walking as much. Some mornings, Caleb found her staring out the window, silent and distant. "I survived a stroke," she told him, one February evening, her voice barely a whisper. "But I don't know if I can survive my own children." Caleb added more cameras. He logged every visitor, every phone call, every piece of mail. He started recording video diaries with Margaret, her telling stories, explaining her choices, speaking directly to a camera about why she was changing her will and why Caleb deserved what she was leaving him. It was insurance, evidence, proof that she was in control of her own life. In March, Margaret finished something she'd been working on for months, a memoir. Caleb had helped her type it, but the words were all hers. Stories of her life, her regrets, her pride in the work she'd done, and her heartbreak over what her children had become. She had 50 copies printed and stored them in Harrison Webb's vault. "When I'm gone," she told Caleb, "they'll try to rewrite history, but my words in my voice will speak the truth." Then on March 28th, Margaret's phone buzzed. She picked it up, read the message, and her face went pale. Caleb crossed the room. "What is it?" She handed him the phone without a word. The text was from Nathaniel's wife, clearly meant for Evelyn. "The lawyer says if she dies before changing it back, we can contest based on undue influence. How much longer does she have?" Caleb's blood ran cold. Margaret looked at him, fear replacing the strength she'd rebuilt over the past year. "They're not waiting for me to die naturally," she whispered. And for the first time, Caleb realized the cameras might not be enough. Margaret's hand trembled as she held the phone, staring at the accidental text. The words blurred, but their meaning was crystal clear. Her children weren't just waiting for her to die. They were discussing timelines. Harrison Webb arrived within the hour. He read the message, his jaw tightening with each word. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "This is conspiracy. Intent." Margaret set the phone down, her face drained of color, but her voice steady. "I want them gone, Harrison. No more visits. No more chances." The letters went out the next day. Formal, legal, absolute. All future communication must go through her attorney. The mansion's locks were changed. A new security system installed. Motion sensors, upgraded cameras, panic buttons in every room. Caleb kept a detailed visitor log, recording every delivery, every service call, every person who stepped onto the property. The retaliation came fast. By May, articles appeared in Charleston papers. Vague, but damaging. Concerns raised over elderly philanthropists' isolation. Family fears, caregivers' influence. The stories never named Caleb directly, but the implication hung in every paragraph. Then the social media accounts appeared. Anonymous posts with photos of the mansion, claims of elder abuse, calls for investigation. Adult Protective Services showed up twice in June. Each time the investigators left satisfied. Margaret was articulate, well cared for, clearly in control of her own life. But the attacks left marks deeper than bruises. In late June, Margaret woke gasping, clutching her chest. Caleb found her pale and shaking, her heart racing erratically. The paramedics came. The hospital kept her for 3 days. Stress-induced cardiac event, the doctor said. Her heart was struggling under the weight her children had placed on it. When she came home, something had shifted. Margaret looked at Caleb differently, not with gratitude or dependence, but with curiosity. "Tell me about your father," she said one afternoon, sitting in the garden with a blanket across her lap. Caleb hesitated. "Mrs. Bellwood, you should rest. I've rested enough for 3 lifetimes. Talk to me." So he did. He told her about growing up in rural Georgia, about his father's small repair shop, about learning to fix engines on Saturday mornings. He told her about the medical bills that came after the cancer diagnosis, about watching his father's savings disappear into treatments that only bought time, never hope. He told her about the last conversation they had. his father's only regret being that Caleb had given up teaching to care for him. Margaret listened, without interrupting. When he finished, tears tracked silently down her cheeks. "I never got to do this with my own children," she said softly. "They never wanted to know me, just what I could give them." That summer became something neither of them expected. Margaret wanted to know everything. Caleb's abandoned dreams, his favorite books, the things that made him laugh. In turn, she shared stories she'd never told anyone. Not the public ones about ribbon cuttings and charity galas, but the private ones. Her first teaching job in a one-room schoolhouse. The miscarriage before Nathaniel. The affair her husband had that she forgave but never forgot. In August, Margaret made a call that surprised him. "I've established a scholarship," she told Caleb over breakfast, "in your father's name. Full ride for students pursuing education degrees at Georgia State." Caleb stared at her, unable to speak. "You gave up teaching to care for him," Margaret continued. "Then you gave up everything to care for me. Let someone else get the chance you didn't." She also quietly paid off the remaining medical debt, still haunting Caleb's credit, donated to his hometown library, and funded repairs for his father's old church. She never asked for gratitude. She simply did it, the way she'd done everything in her life, with purpose and without fanfare. The cameras captured everything that summer. Margaret laughing as Caleb burned dinner again. Caleb steadying her as she walked unassisted across the garden. The two of them bent over foundation documents, planning the future of schools that would bear her name long after she was gone. By fall, Margaret's health had stabilized in ways her doctors called remarkable. She was walking farther, speaking more clearly, even regaining weight she'd lost after the stroke. Her cardiologist adjusted her medications downward. Her physical therapist reported progress that seemed impossible for a woman her age with her history. "It's not medicine," Margaret told Caleb one evening. "It's spite. I'm not giving them the satisfaction of dying before I finish this." In November, they hosted an event that made Nathaniel's lawyer threaten another lawsuit. 30 people gathered at the mansion. Scholarship recipients who'd graduated college because of the Bellwood Foundation, teachers from schools she'd built, community leaders whose programs she'd funded. It wasn't a party, it was a testimony. One by one, they stood in Margaret's living room and told their stories. How her foundation had changed their lives, how her schools had saved their communities, how her vision had created futures that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, Caleb beside her, and listened with tears streaming down her face. "I wanted witnesses," she told him, after everyone left. 30 people who can say they saw me whole, happy, and in my right mind. So when they claim you manipulated me, these people can tell the truth. Winter came with the final preparations. Margaret updated her will one last time, adding even more documentation. She recorded a video, 20 minutes of her speaking directly to the camera, explaining every decision, every reason, every choice. "I am Margaret Ann Bellwood, of sound mind and clear judgment," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "My children chose money over love. Caleb Morrison chose love without any expectation of money. This is not manipulation. This is justice." February arrived with cold rain and a strange, heavy quiet. On Valentine's Day, Margaret insisted on working in the garden. She wanted to plant bulbs for spring flowers she might not live to see. Caleb tried to convince her to wait, but she was stubborn. "I've waited enough," she said. They were kneeling in the dirt, Margaret's hands shaky but determined, when she gasped. The trowel fell from her hand. Her face went grey. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. The ambulance took 12 minutes. Caleb rode with her, holding her hand, watching her drift in and out of consciousness. At Charleston Medical Center, doctors ran tests while Caleb paced the waiting room, his clothes still covered in garden soil. The oncologist who delivered the news was young, her expression carefully neutral. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It's advanced, likely been growing for months. Caleb's legs went weak. Treatment options. At this stage, with her age and medical history, treatment would likely cause more harm than good. We're looking at weeks, maybe 2 months. Margaret was awake when they told her. She took the news the way she'd taken everything, with quiet dignity and steel resolve. How long? She asked. 6 to 8 weeks. Possibly less. Margaret looked at Caleb, something unreadable passing through her eyes. Then she turned back to the doctor. Then we don't have much time. Neither of them noticed Evelyn's car in the hospital parking lot. Neither saw her on the phone, watching Caleb's Honda through the rain-streaked windshield. The final countdown had begun. And this time, the cameras wouldn't be enough to protect what came next. Margaret came home from the hospital with 8 weeks to live, maybe less. She refused the hospice facility the doctors recommended, refused the sterile rooms and clinical efficiency of a place designed for dying. I want my garden, she told Caleb, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to see the sun. Caleb converted the sunroom into something between a bedroom and a sanctuary. Hospital bed positioned to face the windows. Monitors kept discreet in the corner. Photographs covering every surface. Margaret's schools, her foundation work, the life she'd built before her children tried to bury it. Fresh flowers delivered daily, filling the room with color she could barely see anymore. The silence from Nathaniel and Evelyn was absolute. No phone calls, no visits, no acknowledgement that their mother was dying. They're waiting, Margaret said one afternoon in late February. Her breathing labored, making sure there's no deathbed reconciliation, no moment of guilt that might change my will. Caleb adjusted her pillows, his throat tight. You don't need them. I know. Her eyes drifted to the garden beyond the glass. But it still hurts. Then on March 1st, Harrison Webb's phone rang. Nathaniel's voice was measured, almost gentle. He wanted a family meeting, a chance to say goodbye properly, to reconcile before it was too late. Margaret's face crumpled when Webb told her. Hope and suspicion warred in her eyes. Do you believe him? Caleb asked quietly. No, she whispered, but I want to. Webb negotiated the terms. The meeting would be recorded. He would be present. Any attempt at coercion would end it immediately. Nathaniel agreed to everything. They came on March 5th. Nathaniel, Evelyn, and Evelyn's husband, Richard. They brought flowers, brought chairs, brought concern that looked almost genuine. They also brought Dr. Paul Hendricks. The psychiatrist introduced himself as a family friend, someone who specialized in elder care. He sat beside Margaret's bed with a kind smile and a clipboard, asking gentle questions about how she was feeling, whether she was comfortable, if she needed anything. Then the questions changed. Mrs. Bellwood, can you tell me what year it is? Margaret's eyes narrowed. 2024, March 5th, Tuesday. And who are these people in the room? My children, who haven't visited in months. My attorney, who actually cares. And a stranger asking questions he has no right to ask. Hendricks smiled, unruffled. I'm just trying to ensure you're receiving proper care. Now, have you made any significant financial decisions recently? Caleb stood from his chair in the corner. What is this? This is a competency evaluation, Nathaniel said calmly. We have concerns about Mother's state of mind. Margaret tried to sit up, her face flushing with anger and exertion. You want to declare me incompetent? On my deathbed? We want to make sure you're protected, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with false concern. That you're making decisions freely, without influence. For 90 minutes they tried. Hendricks asked complex questions about her finances, her properties, her foundation. He asked about her daily routine, her medications, her relationship with Caleb. Every question designed to confuse, to catch her in a contradiction, to build a case for diminished capacity. Margaret answered every single one perfectly. She cited account numbers from memory, explained the legal structure of her trust, detailed exactly how much money Nathaniel had stolen and when. Her voice grew weaker with each answer, her breathing more labored, but her mind stayed diamond sharp. Finally, Hendricks leaned forward, with practiced sympathy. Mrs. Bellwood, isn't it possible that your caregiver has influenced your thinking? That you're not seeing the situation clearly? Something ignited behind Margaret's exhausted eyes. I am dying, Doctor. Not demented. Her voice, though weak, carried absolute authority. My children abandoned me when I couldn't speak, when I couldn't walk, when I needed someone to see me as human instead of an inheritance. She gestured weakly toward Caleb. This man gave me dignity, friendship, purpose. You gave me nothing but greed dressed up as concern. She paused, gathering breath, her gaze sweeping across Nathaniel and Evelyn. You will not gaslight me on my deathbed. Get out of my home. Harrison Webb stood, his voice cold and formal. This meeting is over. Any further contact without Mrs. Bellwood's explicit written consent will result in harassment charges and a restraining order. They left, but Nathaniel paused at the door. His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and ugly underneath. You're making a terrible mistake, Mother. His voice was quiet, venomous. That money is our birthright. We'll make sure he never sees a dime of it. The door closed. The cameras caught every word. Margaret collapsed back against her pillows, the effort of the confrontation draining what little strength she had left. Caleb moved to her side, checking her pulse, adjusting her oxygen. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have stopped it sooner. No. Her hand found his, her grip weak but insistent. They needed to show their true faces. One last time. For the record. Her health deteriorated rapidly after that. The stress accelerated everything the cancer had already started. By March 15th, she was barely conscious most days, drifting in and out of morphine-induced sleep. Caleb stayed beside her constantly, sleeping in the chair when he slept at all. On March 18th, during a rare moment of clarity, Margaret's eyes opened. She looked at Caleb with perfect recognition, perfect awareness. They're going to come for you, she whispered, after I'm gone. Promise me you'll fight. Caleb's throat closed. I promise. Don't let them erase what we built. Her fingers tightened around his. Don't let them win. I won't, she smiled then, peaceful and certain, and closed her eyes. Margaret Ann Bellwood died at 6:47 a.m. on March 19th, 2024. Caleb was holding her hand, reading the 23rd Psalm, telling her she'd be remembered, promising to honor everything she'd stood for. The cameras captured all of it. The dignity, the peace, the quiet end of a woman who'd fought until her final breath. At 9:15 a.m., Caleb heard tires on gravel, multiple vehicles moving fast. He looked out the window and saw Nathaniel's Mercedes, Evelyn's SUV, and 2 police cruisers pulling into the circular drive. His stomach dropped. The doorbell rang. Caleb opened it on shaking legs. 4 officers stood on the porch, Nathaniel and Evelyn behind them, their faces masks of grief and righteous anger. Nathaniel spoke loudly, clearly, his voice carrying. "Officers, this is the man who held my mother captive, who isolated her from her family, who stole millions from a vulnerable dying woman." One officer stepped forward, hand resting on his belt. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." Caleb looked past them, toward the sunroom where Margaret's body still lay, and realized the war she'd warned him about had finally begun. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant. Caleb sat in interview room 3, still wearing the same clothes he'd had on for 3 days. Margaret's perfume still clung faintly to his shirt collar. He couldn't stop seeing her final breath, the way her hand had gone still in his. Detective Sarah Raines sat across from him, a thick folder between them. She was older, sharp-eyed, the kind of cop who'd seen everything and believed nothing until proven. "Mr. Morrison," she began, her tone neutral, "Margaret Bellwood's children have filed serious allegations. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, coercion. They claim you isolated their mother and manipulated her into changing her will." Caleb's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the cold metal table. "That's not what happened." "Then tell me what did happen." He took a breath, trying to organize 2 years of his life into sentences that wouldn't sound rehearsed. "I was her caregiver. She'd had a stroke. Her children visited maybe 4 times in 2 years. She was alone, forgotten. I didn't manipulate her. I just stayed. And in exchange for staying, she left you $2.6 million. The number hung in the air between them, ugly and impossible. "She left me her legacy," Caleb said quietly. "The foundation. The work she cared about. The money was just the means to continue it." Raines leaned back, studying him. "Her son claims you administered medications incorrectly, that you may have hastened her death." Something broke inside Caleb's chest. "I kept her alive. I kept her human. When she couldn't speak, I taught her to speak again. When she couldn't walk, I helped her walk. When her own children tried to have her declared incompetent, I helped her prove them wrong." Why would they do that if they loved her? Because they didn't love her. They loved what she was worth. The interrogation went on for hours. The same questions rephrased, circled back, tested from different angles. Raines was fair but relentless. Caleb answered everything the same way because it was the truth. And the truth didn't change, no matter how many times you asked. Finally, Raines closed her folder. "We'll need to review the evidence you mentioned. The security footage, medical records, all of it. Harrison Webb has everything. He'll give you whatever you need. If your story checks out, Mr. Morrison, you'll be cleared. But until then, you need to understand something." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Rich families don't like losing money. They have lawyers, connections, media contacts. Even if you're innocent, this is going to get ugly." Caleb met her eyes. "It's already ugly." While Caleb sat in that interrogation room, Nathaniel and Evelyn were already moving. By noon, every major news outlet in Charleston had received their press release. By 3 p.m., the story was everywhere. Family fights to protect dying mother from predatory caregiver. They leak details of the will, Margaret's fortune, Caleb's background, a nobody from rural Georgia with no family, no money, no reason a wealthy widow would leave him everything unless something sinister had happened. The cameras loved it. The headlines wrote themselves. At 6 p.m., Harrison Webb called his own press conference on the courthouse steps. He looked every bit the veteran attorney. Silver-haired, immaculate suit, voice that carried authority. Margaret Bellwood was a brilliant, competent woman until her final breath, he said, cameras flashing. Her children are not grieving. They are contesting a will because their mother chose to leave her legacy to someone who earned it through loyalty and compassion, not blood and greed. He played clips, Margaret speaking clearly, explaining her choices. The security footage of Nathaniel's threats, Evelyn's midnight intrusion, the doctors they'd brought to declare her incompetent who'd refused. The narrative shifted, but only slightly. The damage was already spreading through social media, through comment sections, through whispered conversations in Charleston's wealthy circles. At 11 p.m., Detective Raines released Caleb without charges. No evidence of theft. No signs of coercion. No medical malpractice. Just a caregiver who'd done his job, and a woman who'd made her own choices. But when Caleb walked out of the police station, cameras swarmed like insects drawn to light. Microphones thrust in his face. Reporters shouting questions over each other. Did you manipulate Margaret Bellwood? How do you justify stealing millions from a dying woman? What did you promise her? Caleb kept his head down, saying nothing. Harrison Webb's hand on his shoulder, guiding him through the mob to the car. The cameras followed them all the way out of the parking lot. Webb drove him to a hotel across town, paid for a week in cash, told him not to go home, not to talk to anyone, not to trust anyone he didn't absolutely have to. They're not done, Webb said before leaving. This was just the opening move. Caleb sat on the hotel bed at midnight, the room dark except for the glow of his phone. He'd turned it off hours ago, couldn't stand the notifications, the messages from numbers he didn't recognize. But when he finally turned it back on, there was one new email. No subject line. Sent from an anonymous account. He opened it with trembling hands. The message was a single sentence. You think cameras will save you? We know how to make people disappear. Below it, an attachment loaded slowly. A photograph. Taken that evening outside the police station. Caleb's face caught in the flash of cameras, looking lost and terrified. But the photo had been taken from across the street, from a high angle. Someone with a clear line of sight, who'd been waiting, watching. Someone who wanted him to know they were still there. Caleb stared at the image until his vision blurred, until his hands stopped shaking and went numb, until the fear crystallized into something harder. This wasn't over. Margaret had warned him. And whoever sent this message wanted him to know that even with all his evidence, all his proof, all his truth, he still wasn't safe. The courthouse steps were packed with cameras and reporters when Caleb arrived on March 21st. Harrison Webb walked beside him, a wall between Caleb and the chaos. Inside, the courtroom smelled like old wood and anxiety. Nathaniel and Evelyn sat on the opposite side with their legal team. 3 attorneys in expensive suits, leather briefcases, and expressions that said they'd already won. Evelyn wouldn't look at Caleb. Nathaniel stared directly at him, his jaw tight with something that looked like hatred. Judge Helena Morrison entered, and the room stood. She was in her 60s, grey-haired with eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the petition in silence, then looked up. This court will determine whether Margaret Bellwood's final will and testament represents her true intentions or the result of undue influence. We will proceed with evidence, not emotion. The first week was brutal. Nathaniel's attorneys built their case like architects designing a prison. Every brick laid carefully, every detail meant to trap Caleb inside the story of a predator who'd isolated a vulnerable woman and stolen her fortune. They brought psychiatrists who'd never met Margaret, but spoke with authority about patterns of manipulation. How caregivers create dependency. How elderly stroke victims are susceptible to coercion. How a young man with nothing to lose and everything to gain would exploit that vulnerability. Caleb sat through it all, his hands clenched under the table, watching his character get dissected and rebuilt into something monstrous. Then Harrison Webb stood. He didn't argue with words first. He argued with Margaret's voice. The courtroom lights dimmed. A screen descended, and Margaret Bellwood appeared, sitting in her sunroom 3 months before her death, speaking directly to the camera. "I know my children will contest this will," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I know they'll claim Caleb manipulated me. So let me be absolutely clear." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp with the intelligence that had built schools and changed lives. "I am making these decisions freely, with full understanding. Nathaniel and Evelyn chose their inheritance over their mother. They saw me as an ATM, not a human being. Caleb asked for nothing and gave everything." A pause. Her expression softened. "This is not manipulation. This is gratitude. This is justice. And this is my final act of love for the man who showed me love when my own blood showed me indifference." The video ended. The courtroom stayed silent. One of the jurors wiped her eyes. Another stared at Nathaniel with something that looked like disgust. Webb let the silence stretch. Then he began pulling out evidence like a magician revealing cards. Medical records showing Margaret's cognitive improvements. Witness statements from 30 people who'd interacted with her in her final years. Security footage of Nathaniel's threats and Evelyn's midnight break-in. He played the audio from the March 5th meeting. Nathaniel's voice, cold and venomous. "We'll make sure he never sees a dime of it." Evelyn's attorney tried to recover. On April 15th, she stood with practiced outrage. "Even if Mrs. Bellwood was competent, this bequest is unconscionable. A caregiver should never inherit from a patient. It violates every ethical boundary." Judge Morrison looked up from her notes, her expression unreadable. "Counselor, South Carolina law allows competent adults to leave property to whomever they choose. Mrs. Bellwood's relationship with Mr. Morrison clearly evolved beyond professional boundaries into legitimate friendship. Unless you can prove coercion, which your evidence hasn't, your argument is moral grandstanding, not legal reasoning." The gallery murmured. Nathaniel's face went red. His attorney sat down. But outside the courtroom, the war turned darker. Caleb's car was keyed in the parking garage. Long, deliberate scratches, spelling out thief across the driver's side. Someone spray-painted murderer on the sidewalk outside his hotel. His phone filled with messages from blocked numbers. Most too vile to read past the first line. Harrison Webb's office window was shattered by a brick at 2 a.m. No note. No witnesses. Just glass, and a message that didn't need words. The harassment clause in Margaret's will, the one that voided Nathaniel and Evelyn's inheritance if they threatened Caleb, hung over everything like a loaded gun. Their attorneys had warned them. One provable threat, one documented harassment, and they'd lose even the token 100,000 Margaret had left them. So they stayed silent in public. But someone else wasn't bound by legal consequences. By April 25th, the case was clearly tilting toward Caleb. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret's voice too powerful. Webb's presentation too methodical to dismantle. Nathaniel stopped coming to court. Evelyn showed up but sat stone-faced, staring at nothing. On April 28th, Caleb was leaving the courthouse when he heard tires screech. He turned just as a black SUV jumped the curb, heading straight for him. He dove sideways, hit the concrete hard, felt the vehicle's wake rush past him close enough to touch. The SUV swerved back onto the road and disappeared around the corner. No license plate visible. No identifying marks. Caleb lay on the sidewalk, his palms scraped and bleeding, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Security guards ran over. Someone was calling 911. The courthouse cameras had caught everything, except who was driving. That night, Harrison Webb called him at 11 p.m., his voice tight, with controlled anger. Someone left an envelope at my house, hand-delivered. No return address. What was in it? A pause. Photos. You leaving court. Margaret's mansion. My wife at the grocery store. My daughter at school. Webb's voice cracked slightly. And 4 words written in red marker. Drop the case. Caleb closed his eyes, the hotel room spinning slightly. They're not going to stop. No, Webb said quietly. They're not. The question is whether we stop first. Caleb thought about Margaret, her final words, her promise that he'd fight, her trust that he'd honor what they'd built together. We don't stop, he said, even if it gets you killed. Even then, Webb was silent for a long moment. Then, the judge rules in 3 days. Whatever happens between now and then, stay somewhere they can't find you. And Caleb, yeah, watch your back, because someone's decided the law isn't moving fast enough. Caleb hung up and stared at the dark window, wondering if somewhere out there, someone was staring back. The courtroom was standing room only. On May the 1st, Caleb sat beside Harrison Webb, his hands folded on the table, trying to keep them from shaking. Across the aisle, Nathaniel and Evelyn sat rigid, their attorneys whispering last-minute strategies that wouldn't matter anymore. Judge Helena Morrison entered. Everyone rose. The air felt thick, charged with 2 months of accusations and evidence and hatred that had nowhere left to go but into this moment. She settled into her seat, adjusted her glasses, and opened the file that would determine everything. After reviewing extensive evidence, testimony, and Mrs. Margaret Bellwood's own documented wishes, she began, her voice clear and authoritative. This court finds no evidence of undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, or fraud. Caleb felt his chest unlock slightly. Beside him, Webb remained perfectly still. Mrs. Bellwood was a competent adult making informed decisions about her estate. Her cognitive function was thoroughly documented. Her intentions were explicitly stated. This will stands as written. Nathaniel's face drained of color. Evelyn's hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, her tone hardening, this court notes with grave concern the pattern of harassment, threats, and criminal intimidation directed at Mr. Morrison and his legal counsel. She looked directly at Nathaniel and Evelyn, her gaze cutting through the courtroom's sudden tension. Mrs. Bellwood included a specific clause in her will. Any family member engaging in harassment or criminal acts against Mr. Morrison would forfeit their inheritance entirely. Security footage, police reports, and documented threats establish that this clause has been triggered. Evelyn made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Therefore, the $100,000 bequest to Nathaniel and Evelyn Bellwood are hereby voided. The entire estate, $2.6 million, the Bellwood mansion, and all associated assets, is awarded to Caleb Morrison as Margaret Bellwood intended. The gavel came down. The courtroom exploded. Nathaniel surged to his feet, lunging toward Caleb before bailiffs caught him, their hands on his arms, pulling him back. He was shouting something, his face twisted with rage. But Caleb couldn't hear the words over the chaos. Evelyn collapsed into her chair, sobbing into her hands. Caleb just sat there, numb, not celebrating, not vindicated, just exhausted. Webb's hand landed on his shoulder, squeezing once. It's over. But when they walked out into the courthouse lobby, cameras swarmed like locusts, reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward, the flash of lights blinding. And then Nathaniel's voice cut through the noise, loud and clear, recorded by every camera in the vicinity. This is theft. That man stole our mother and stole our inheritance. Someone needs to make this right. The implicit threat hung in the air. Webb's expression went cold. That was a mistake, he said quietly. That night, Charleston PD arrested Nathaniel Bellwood outside his home. The charges came fast: terroristic threats, conspiracy, attempted assault. The investigation that followed unraveled everything. Phone records connecting Nathaniel to the driver of the black SUV. Bank transfers to a private investigator who'd been following Caleb for weeks. Text messages discussing how to solve the problem permanently if the legal system didn't cooperate. Evelyn, facing accessory charges, broke within 48 hours. She gave them everything: recorded conversations, emails, Nathaniel's plans to make Caleb disappear if the will wasn't overturned. She claimed she'd tried to stop him, but the evidence suggested she'd known all along. The media devoured it. The Bellwood name, once synonymous with philanthropy and Charleston high society, became a cautionary tale about greed and entitlement. Former friends distanced themselves. Business partners issued statements. The scandal consumed everything the family had built over generations. Nathaniel was sentenced to 8 years. Evelyn got 3 years probation and 1,000 hours of community service. Both were permanently barred from any future claim to Margaret's estate. Caleb watched the sentencing from the back of the courtroom, feeling nothing but a hollow kind of sadness. This was what Margaret had feared, what she'd tried to prevent. And in the end, her children had proven every terrible thing she'd believed about them. On May 15th, 2 weeks after the verdict, Caleb stood in Margaret's garden. The roses were blooming, deep red, the color she'd loved. The fountain was running, its sound gentle and constant. The mansion rose behind him, all white columns and pristine windows, beautiful and empty. He'd spent the past 2 weeks deciding what to do with it all. The money, the house, the legacy Margaret had trusted him to protect. That afternoon, he held a press conference on the mansion's front steps. The same reporters who'd called him a thief now listened with different expressions: curiosity, respect, maybe even shame. Margaret Bellwood didn't leave me this estate to make me wealthy, Caleb said, reading from notes he'd written the night before. She left it to me because she trusted I'd finish what she started. He explained his plans. The mansion would become the headquarters of the re-established Bellwood Foundation. The $2.6 million would fund scholarships, build schools, support the communities Margaret had always cared about. Every dollar would go toward the work her children had abandoned for profit. This isn't my money, he continued. It's hers, and I'm going to make sure it does what she always intended it to do, change lives. He hired the 30 people who'd attended Margaret's goodbye party to serve on the foundation's board, established the Margaret Ann Bellwood Scholarship for caregivers pursuing education, commissioned a statue of her for the garden, captured in the moment she'd loved most, painting by the fountain, her face turned toward the sun. In the mansion's entryway, he installed a bronze plaque with words Margaret had written in her memoir. Love isn't inherited. It's earned through presence, not blood. May everyone who enters here remember that the greatest wealth is connection, and the greatest legacy is the lives we touch. That evening, Caleb sat alone in the sunroom, where Margaret had spent her final months. The cameras were still there, still recording, still preserving everything. He decided to keep them running, an archive of what loyalty looked like when everything else fell apart. He thought about the promise he'd made her, about the fight she'd asked him to finish, about the justice she'd believed was possible even when her own children proved it wasn't easy. And he realized something that made his chest ache. Margaret had won. Not because the courts ruled in her favor, not because her children went to prison, but because she'd found someone who saw her as human when everyone else saw her as a means to an end. That was the real inheritance, the one that couldn't be stolen or contested or voided. Outside, the garden was settling into dusk, shadows stretching across the paths where they'd walked together. Caleb sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by Margaret's life, and wondered if she was watching somehow, proud of what he'd kept, sad about what it cost, grateful that someone had finally kept their promise. The cameras kept recording. The foundation was ready to launch. And somewhere in Charleston, 30 people whose lives Margaret had touched were preparing to make sure her real legacy, not the one her children wanted, but the one she'd earned, would outlive them all.